The Merrimack was launched on June 15, 1855. She was 3,200 tons, 275 feet long. She had a 28.5-foot beam, a 24-foot draft. She moved by sail and had steam engines that powered screw propellers. She had a top speed of 12 knots. Her armaments were 14 8-inch guns, 2 10-inch guns, and 24 9-inch guns. She spent time in the Caribbean, in Europe, and part of the Pacific Fleet before returning to Norfolk, Virginia in 1860. She was decommissioned for repairs. America had been on the verge of war for years by this point, and the election of 1860 sent us over the edge. The candidates were Republican Abraham Lincoln, Southern Democrat John C. Breckinridge, Constitutional Union John Bell, and Democrat Stephen Douglas. Abraham Lincoln didn't even appear on the ballot in 10 southern states, but he won the electoral votes needed to become president with 180. Breckinridge earned 72, Bell 39, and Douglas 12. Lincoln becoming president was the final straw for many in the South, with fears of losing state rights and slavery. States began seceding from the Union. First, South Carolina, December 20th, 1860. Mississippi, January 9th, 1861. Florida, January 10th. Alabama, January 11th. Georgia, January 19th. Louisiana, January 26th. Texas, February 1st. 4 more states threatened secession: Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. The Merrimack was still in Norfolk Navy Yard. It was called Gosport Navy Yard at the time. With tensions building in Virginia, the U.S. planned to hold on to the Navy Yard. Many valuable ships were in the yard. Virginia seceded from the Union on April 17, 1861, and the shipyard received orders to burn the shipyard to the ground rather than to let the Confederates take over. But the Federal troops were tricked into leaving the shipyard before it could be completely destroyed. William Mahone of the Norfolk and Petersburg Railroad thought up a plan to trick the Federals into thinking a large-scale attack was coming. He had a single train sent into Norfolk across the river, and he made sure the Federals knew it had arrived by blowing the whistle repeatedly. The train was then sent back and forth over and over again into Norfolk in an attempt to trick the Federals into thinking a large amount of Confederate soldiers had arrived. This ruse worked, and the troops at the yard quickly fled, taking what they could. Unfortunately, secessionists had blocked the channel by sinking small boats in it the previous night, so the Merrimack was trapped. The United States Navy set fire to the Merrimack. She burned down to the waterline and then sank. The Confederates took control of the Navy Yard after the Federals fled. The yard contained large stocks of cannons, rifles, and ammunition. Over 1,000 cannons had been left behind. It was also full of valuable materials used for shipbuilding. The Union's Anaconda Plan was put into effect shortly after the war started. Blockade ships were now stopping goods from entering and exiting the newly formed Confederacy. After the Confederates took the Navy Yard, they knew they had to combat the Union blockade and try to challenge Union naval superiority. They wanted to build an ironclad warship. In 1859, the French had built the ironclad La Gloire. It was the world's first fully functional ocean-going ironclad warship. It had a wooden hull and it was covered in iron plates. In 1860, the British built the world's first iron-hulled warship, the HMS Warrior. The time had arrived when wooden warships that had been a staple for navies around the world for centuries. It was now over. Wooden ships did not stand a chance against these new ironclad vessels. The Confederates wanted to build a similar ironclad, and they needed it as quickly as possible. Their manufacturing was not as nearly advanced as the Union's, plus the shipyard had been damaged, and the time it would take to build an ironclad from the ground up would take far too long. After some time, the Merrimack's wreck was surveyed, and the Confederates found that her hull was intact, and the machinery was not damaged. The ship was burned to the waterline, but everything below was in good shape. Stephen Mallory, Secretary of the Navy, decided that the Merrimack would be raised. Her hull and engines would be used as the platform to build the Ironclad. The Merrimack was the only ship large enough in the area that could be used that still had engines and boilers. This would save a tremendous amount of time and resources. Lieutenant John Mercer Brooke and Lieutenant John Porter both drew up designs for the Ironclad. Brooke's design was chosen, and Porter was put in charge of construction. Much of the hull was cut down to the waterline, and a new flat main deck was built and reinforced to hold the weight. The bow was turned into a V shape to deflect water. The casemate covered most of the ship's deck, creating a low profile. It was 24 inches thick, made from oak and pine, and covered in 2-inch layers of iron. The armor sloped at an angle of 36 degrees to help deflect enemy cannon fire. After the Confederates learned that the Union were also building an ironclad, it was decided they needed to add a weapon that could take down an ironclad. They believed that cannons could not penetrate ironclad armor, so an iron ram would be attached to the bow. The casemate had 14 gun ports with 10 cannons. Her armaments were 4 muzzle-loading Brooke rifles, 6 smoothbore 9-inch Dahlgren guns, 2 stern pivot guns, and 2 6.4-inch cannons. The ship used a single screw propeller powered by the steam engines. The engines on board the Merrimack were supposed to have been replaced, but she was burned and sunk before the work had been done. Her engines were tired, and the time spent underwater didn't help the matter. She was incredibly heavy now, and her 12 knots she could have traveled before was now cut down to just 5 or 6 knots. She needed a 1-mile radius to turn around, and it took 45 minutes to do so. Her name was changed from the Merrimack to the CSS Virginia. On February 24, 1862, Stephen Mallory, Confederate States Secretary of the Navy, appointed Franklin Buchanan to the Confederate Navy James River Squadron flag officer, and he was selected as captain of the newly named CSS Virginia. News reached the Union that the Confederates were building an ironclad, even though it was supposed to be a secret. The Union decided they needed to build an ironclad to rival the CSS Virginia, and they needed it done fast. They feared what would happen if a Confederate ironclad had free reign on the East Coast, destroying ships and towns up and down the coast, even though the Confederates had no plans to take the Virginia north. Congress approved $1.5 million to pay for the ironclad warships. The Navy also founded the Ironclad Board to make decisions about the ironclads. The Navy bought advertising requesting designs for the ironclads. Swedish engineer John Ericsson came up with the design based on Swedish lumber rafts. The Ironclad Board chose only 3 designs to move forward with. Ericsson traveled to DC to convince the board of its seaworthiness. They declined, but President Lincoln convinced the board to approve the design. The Monitor's design was revolutionary, particularly for its revolving turret. It had a low freeboard, an iron hull, and the fact that it was run only by steam engines. The Monitor was 172 feet long, 41 feet 6 inches wide, and had a draft of 10 feet 6 inches. Her final weight was over 1,000 tons, very heavy for her size. She had a top speed of 6 knots. She had ventilation blowers and fans to circulate air inside the ship. The deck was iron-plated. The armor plates were 1 inch thick. The pilot house held the ship's steering controls. It was made out of iron and had slits to look out of. The turret was made of 8 layers of iron plate, making it 8 inches thick. It sat on a rotating spindle. It could rotate 360 degrees. The turret was powered by the ship's main steam engine. A separate system connected the engine to the turret, and gears and levers allowed the crew to rotate the turret if needed. It made a full rotation in 22.5 seconds. The turret sat on a rubber gasket, making it watertight. It was not held down by anything, just the weight of itself and gravity. The turret was supposed to have two 15-inch Dahlgren guns, but they were not ready at the time, so two 11-inch Dahlgrens were used instead, weighing 16,000 pounds each. At the time, a 15-pound gunpowder charge was the maximum amount that could be used in the gun safely, but later on in the war, 30-pound charges were used. The guns were mounted side by side on sliding carriages. The turret had two gun ports that were fitted with iron shutters to protect the crew from incoming fire when the guns were not being used. The crew's vision was limited, and aiming would prove to be difficult. Later on, the pilot house would have to yell to the gun crews to help them aim more accurately. It took 118 days to finish the USS Monitor. She left New York and was headed towards Virginia on March 6, 1862, Lieutenant John Warden as commanding officer. On March 7th and into the 8th, disaster struck. While the Monitor was being towed in choppy water, the commander had ordered that the turret be wedged up, and he had cloth shoved in around the gap. He did not trust the seal, but this proved to be a bad idea. Water rushed in through the gap. Water also came in through the funnels and through the ventilation pipes. The fires in the boiler went out, crippling the ship, and toxins filled the engine room, causing men to pass out. They had to be brought into the turret for fresh air. Eventually, the water was drained from the fans, and the fires were started again. But the rudder was jammed, and the Monitor had to be towed out of the choppy water so that she could be fixed. Meanwhile, the CSS Virginia was now ready, and at about noon on March 8th, she left Gosport Naval Yard with a fleet of support vessels. The Raleigh, Beaufort, Patrick Henry, Jamestown, and Teaser. They headed for the Union fleet at Hampton Roads to attack the blockade ships. Her main goal was to break the Union blockade. The CSS Virginia spotted the Union ships and headed for its first target, the USS Cumberland, a wooden sloop of war. The Virginia fired on the Cumberland, and her crew fired back. The shells bounced off of the Virginia's armor. The slow-moving Virginia aimed directly for the Cumberland and rammed her with her iron ram. The Virginia tore a massive hole in the Cumberland's hull, and the Virginia was now stuck in the side of the Cumberland. She began to sink, taking the Virginia down with her. But the ram broke off as the Cumberland went under, freeing the Virginia. The Virginia's next target was the USS Congress. The Congress's captain decided to ground his ship after seeing the fate of the Cumberland. The Virginia, along with her support vessels, began firing on the Congress from a safe distance. The ship caught fire, and many of her crew died, including her commander. After an hour, the ship raised a white flag, surrendering to the Virginia. The Virginia went to take prisoners and take control of the vessel, but Union shore batteries fired on them. While the sailors from the Congress tried to escape, the Virginia's captain, Flag Officer Buchanan, went on deck and ordered his men to fire on the fleeing men. And he ordered hot shot to be heated and then fired onto the Congress. While on deck, Buchanan was hit by a Union sharpshooter in the leg. The Congress would continue to burn that night down to the waterline and exploded when fire made it to the ship's magazine. The Virginia then turned its attention to the USS Minnesota, who had run aground earlier in the battle when trying to aid the Congress and Cumberland. The Virginia could not get close enough to destroy the Minnesota. The tide was turning, and Virginia's captain feared she would run aground. The Minnesota had been hit numerous times, but she remained intact. The Virginia turned and withdrew for safe waters, planning to finish off the Minnesota in the morning. There were 250 Union dead. Only 2 men died on the Virginia. The USS Monitor arrived at Hampton Roads that night, and saw the devastation that the Virginia had inflicted on the Union ships. The Monitor and her crew intended to protect the stricken Minnesota and the rest of the blockade ships if the Virginia returned. The next morning, the Virginia set off to finish what it had started the previous day. Buchanan was injured, so Lieutenant Jones took command. As the Virginia spotted the Minnesota, the crew saw what looked like a boiler in the water being loaded onto a raft. But it was no boiler, it was the Monitor, ready to protect the injured ship. The Virginia fired at the Monitor, but it struck the Minnesota instead. The Monitor steamed out to meet the Virginia. The two ships battled for hours, neither able to pierce the thick iron plate. The Virginia ran aground and the Monitor fired on the stranded ship repeatedly, but the Virginia eventually became unstuck and was back in the fight. The Monitor's turret jammed during the battle, which temporarily kept it from aiming properly. The crew also had trouble aiming, and the turret proved difficult to stop in the right spot. So they let the turret rotate and fired when they thought they were in line with the Virginia. The Virginia tried to ram the Monitor. They did not know that their ram had actually broken off and was embedded in the hull of the Cumberland. Lewis Stoddard was leaning against the wall of the turret when a shell hit close to him. Lewis was knocked unconscious for over an hour. A shell from the Virginia struck the pilot house at nearly point-blank range. Commanding Officer John Warden was looking out of the viewing slits when the shell hit, temporarily blinding him. The Monitor withdrew to assess the situation. The Virginia's crew saw this and believed that the Monitor was retreating and had given up the battle. Lieutenant Green took control of the Monitor, but the Virginia was now steaming off, believing that she had won the battle. The tide had gone out and the Virginia could not get close enough to finish off the Minnesota, so they headed back for Norfolk. The Monitor saw this and believed that the Virginia was retreating and that they had won the battle. The Monitor was hit 22 times, and the Virginia was hit around 20. It has been debated who won the Battle of Hampton Roads ever since 1862, and the debate still goes on today. But both ships would not make it to 1863. The city of Norfolk was abandoned on May 9th, and the Virginia was trapped. Instead of letting the Union capture the ship, she was towed to Craney Island and set on fire. The fire eventually reached the magazine, and she exploded and sank. The Monitor was being towed to North Carolina by the USS Rhode Island when a storm blew in. Waves began crashing over the ship, and she began to flood. The ship's pumps were used, but eventually the flooding was so bad that the pumps could not keep up. The Monitor signaled to Rhode Island for help, and lifeboats were sent to rescue the men. Some of the men were washed overboard while trying to cut the tow line. The men fought for hours trying to save the flooding ship. The pumps failed, and hand pumps and buckets were used. But the Monitor sank 16 miles from Cape Hatteras. 16 men went down with the ship trying to save her. 4 men were inside the turret at the time. 47 men were rescued in the lifeboats. When the ship sank, it capsized, and the turret detached from the ship. The Monitor and the Virginia changed naval warfare forever. Navies around the world would move to ironclads, and eventually battleships with steel hulls. I want to thank you all for watching this, folks. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you on the next. Peace!